I found women all across the region who were ordering hits and greatly feared by the communities that they lived in. So I think this idea that women don't manage or use violence is also, again, something that we don't want to see, right? Because it offends us.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
Welcome to Borderland, Narcosis, an Ironclad original presented by First Form. Go get your First Form supplements at firstform.com/Borderland. My next guest is Deborah Bonello. She is an investigative journalist from the UK who lives currently in Mexico City. She has a lot of information, also the author of a book called Narcosis. We talk about it on the show. If you don't mind, for the audience, would you be able to give them a brief kind of bio of who you are or background of who you are so we can get started?
Sure. Hi there. And yes, of course, thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here. My name's Deborah Bonello. I'm an investigative journalist. I've been in Latin America for about 20 years now. And I arrived just when Mexico was sort of launching its quote unquote drug war. So covering organized crime has always been a very dominant part of what I've done. And I've freelanced a lot. I was the editorial director for Vice News in Latin America for about 4 years. And I'm now managing editor at Insight Crime, which is a nonprofit dedicated to the study of organized crime in the Americas, as well as the author of Narcosis, which is a book about the secret rise of women in the Sinaloa cartel.
I love it. Yeah, I have a few questions about that later on. A couple things before I get to that, but that is extremely fascinating. I'm excited to learn more about that, big time. So,
good. Well, happy to talk about it.
Oh, absolutely, it's going to be great. But what was it that originally got you to Mexico City? How long have you been in Mexico City per se?
I got here in 2006, and at the time, I was working on a thesis about violence against journalists. Which continues to be a problem today, of course, in Mexico and Latin America. But at the time, it was kind of bubbling up. And then, when I got here, I just found reasons to stay. I started working with the Los Angeles Times. I was doing at the time what was a sort of this innovative one-man band kind of reporting where I was doing video and audio and it was when the internet was kind of really shaking up journalism and creating all these kind of multimedia narratives. So as soon as I got here, things sort of started going pretty well. And like the idea of going back to London and going back to business journalism just seemed not for me. So I just ended up staying.
Yeah, it's funny. I only laugh because you said you were studying violence against journalists, but then you go to the one place that seems to be the most dangerous for journalists is in Mexico, right?
That's
Throughout
right.
the years, it's just been, journalists have been targeted throughout the years. And so it's just kind of interesting that you chose the most dangerous route possible.
Well, you know what they say about journalists, whenever there's like a disaster or anything, most people are running away from it and we're running towards it. And I think that happens in all sorts of contexts, But to be clear, the problem with violence against journalists does continue in Mexico, but it tends to be limited to local journalists reporting local issues. And you do see exceptions to that. But for better or for worse, the international press has largely been spared from that kind of violence. So to be clear, I don't run anything near the risks that my local colleagues do, sadly.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So you've been in the game for a long time. I'm curious to know what's your perspective on the drug war and how it's changed throughout the years.
I mean, are you talking about the drug war in Mexico or are you talking about the drug war in Latin America?
Oh, good point. Let's talk about Mexico first.
Because, of course, since September, we've seen the bombing start in the Caribbean, which is a total quantum shift. But what we've seen in Latin America and in Mexico since 2006 and even a little bit prior to that is really kind of the status quo, the pursuit of the kingpin strategy. So you have the very sort of steady plod of rounding up drug bosses and putting them in jail, and that being claimed as something of a victory by both Mexico's government and the United States government, which of course has always been Mexico's kind of most important bilateral partner in terms of the fight against drugs, I would say. And during my 20 years, you've seen the capture of El Chapo Guzman and his very high-profile trial. You've seen a number of very high-profile drug bosses from Mexico taken to the US and tried, and with all the implications that that has. But have you seen a drop in the flow of illegal narcotics from Mexico to the United States? No. Have you seen the stopping of other public health crises? We had the fentanyl and the opioid drug crisis in the US, which thankfully seems to have peaked, but was actually kind of started arguably by the legal drugs industry and the pharmaceutical business. And then, the cartels just kind of jumped on board. So all of these dynamics that we've seen in the last 10 years would suggest to me that, it's hard to know where we'd be in the drug war. Was it not for the kingpin strategy and seizures and arrests and, the continuation of prohibition? Maybe things would be worse. But what is clear is that alone is not stopping drug deaths and or the corruption of democracies by the illegal drug business, not to mention the rampant violence that is much more really Latin America's problem than it is the United States. So
Yeah.
if I was returning the drug war report card, I would say more work needed.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, when Trump took office, I was curious to see, as they've picked up the security on the border, does that slow down drugs? And, what it slowed down is Border Patrol and Customs, capturing drugs, but it doesn't seem that the flow of drugs has slowed down, right? So their means of entry has slowed down by way of the areas that we know of. So there's obviously still drugs coming across. There has been no lull in it, and there's been very little change in price. So for me, it means the supply and demand is still there, and it's not changed. So that's fascinating to me to think like, oh my God, what you thought when you were going to stop immigration, you were going to also stop drugs. That's not true. And so then you see all the stuff that's happening currently right now in Mexico, a lot of violence. I'm curious to know is, you live in Mexico City. Is there still corruption there? And outside of that, I know there is, but is it felt like it is in Jalisco or other cities? And as well as is there something going on that, we're missing here in America when it comes to the drug trade, the cartels? I feel like there's a shift happening and we're not seeing it.
So to go back to your first question, there has been a paradigm shift in drug trafficking in terms of the upsurge of synthetic drugs, right? So drugs like methamphetamine, which is a cash cow for the cartels, and more specifically, fentanyl means you have to traffic less volume to make even bigger profits. So you've seen this state-level legalization of weed in the US, and that has also affected the bulk level of weed that the cartels are trying to get to the US. It's just not worth it. So that does make it harder to, I would say, detect drugs going through the border because there are smaller volumes, right? But I think one key stat that Americans should take on board when there is an attempt to merge the sort of issues of immigration and drug trafficking is most people caught trafficking drugs on the US-Mexico border are in fact US citizens. So this idea that it's being trafficked across, illegal crossing points or thrown over fences by undocumented migrants is really sort of a manipulation of certain facts that are happening on the border. I think that's one of the most important things to take on board. As well as the fact that the sort of availability of fentanyl, now I think the opioid crisis is very much dominated by the cartels. But again, it was sort of a Trojan horse that happened through the legal pharmaceutical industry, which is to say, the cartels are now synthesizing legal substances. There is no legal version of cocaine or methamphetamine, but, fentanyl started as and continues to be an important kind of, opioid used in the medical industry that's being abused and being, illicitly produced. So those sorts of things, I think, to take on board that are super important. In terms of corruption, of course, corruption is a massive, massive problem in Latin America, but I think it's kind of a misunderstanding to assume that it stops it stops south of the Mexican border. There really wouldn't, it wouldn't be possible for drugs to be passing through the US-Mexico border unless there was some kind of corruption on the other side. And I do remember at Vice, a different issue in the terms in the market of like human smuggling. We did an investigative piece on how, American Marines were helping smuggle undocumented migrants once in the US, sort of further north into the US. So I think we have to have like a very broad concept of corruption geographically as well. It isn't just confined to Latin America. Now, is corruption still present in Mexico City? I mean, yes. I think violence in the capital is a lot less common than what we're seeing in Jalisco, Tamaulipas, Sinaloa, where there is a cartel war between the different factions of the Sinaloa cartel. But corruption is a perennial problem throughout Latin America. And as you see, you talk about demand, if there's one thing we know about capitalism, if people want something, they'll get it, and we see it on all levels. You order something from China, it costs a fraction of what it would cost in a store next door, and it's on your doorstep within 3 days. I mean, we both know like all the kind of stuff that requires that to exist. So I think as long as there's demand for drugs, there will always be an illegal drug business. And we've seen a shift in demand for cocaine. The US used to be and remains, I believe, the biggest global producer, but the demand for cocaine in Europe has surged, and the cartels and drug trafficking organizations have responded in kind. So where there's a market for those products, they will go and they will be sold. Which is not to say they shouldn't remain illegal, but the idea that seizures and arrests alone are going to destroy the illegal drug business is I don't think anyone believes that. It's like that that line from The Wire, that they call it a drug war, but wars can be won. And I think anyone, even from the DEA and the administration, will tell you that alone has been proven over the last 5 decades that it doesn't work on its own. So that's my
I asked that
long
question. No, I love that. But I asked that question to a former high-level DEA agent of like, do we just legalize drugs? Is that how? Do we take do we take it out of the hands of the cartel by legalizing it and having some kind of organization to it? Because will that take kind of this, I guess, the push and pull of what happens in the borders? And, at a high level, they always say no. Law enforcement, it will always have the law enforcement mindset. No, it's dangerous, it's bad. Then you go to journalists, you go to other individuals, and they always say yes. And I find it very interesting as someone who's been on both sides of that fence. I don't know what that answer would be. I think both arguments have value. But I do see, even at the highest levels of the government, you very rarely see anyone say, yeah, just legalize it. And I'm always confused by that because we've seen what marijuana has done. And I've still seen marijuana come from across the border, even while it's legal, which is interesting enough. But, that conversation is always, I think it's always split in half by what law enforcement thinks and then what other like journalists and activists have thought in these interviews here with me.
Yeah, and I think it depends on whether you are approaching the drug trade as a public health issue or as a security issue, right? Because I think certainly with the issue of fentanyl or overdoses of any kind of drug, if you legalize and tax it, then you're going to improve its quality, reduce adulteration, and bring down sort of a lot of the health concerns around drug use, right? So you're definitely going to bring down overdoses of all kind, because a lot of overdoses are to do with adulteration and what have you. Maybe 10 years ago, I would have said, if you end prohibition, then that might bring down some of the problems that we're seeing in Latin America when it comes to the corruption of governance, the corruption of security institutions, all that. But what we have seen in Mexico is a massive, and across the region, a massive diversification of criminal groups who now have lots of different sort of criminal market interests, if you like, So it's not just about drugs anymore. It's about extortion. It's about paid killings. We're talking about, environmental crimes, deforestation, illegal mining is a massive industry now across Latin America, gold mining, lithium, and that is having a massive effect on the environment. Extortion is now a huge problem around Latin America. So arguably, like any corporation or any business entity, it's diversified. So if you take away the drug business, are you going to take away some of their profits? Yes, but they will prove themselves, I suspect, pretty agile. Vince, a good example is the whole kind of immigration dynamics that we've seen over the last decade, right? You had this real sort of surge of immigration from Central America to the US-Mexico border, unprecedented levels, especially of Honduran kids, and then people from different countries, Venezuelans as well. And, that became a cash boom for the cartels because they were essentially providing travel services, smuggling services for migrants. So as it became harder to get to the US-Mexico border and harder to cross the US-Mexico border, criminal organizations could ask for more money, right? And the cartels were benefiting from that because they control a lot of the territory that undocumented migrants use to get into the United States. Now, the flow of migrants has really dropped off since especially President Trump took office, and you've seen this whole, again, shift in paradigm in terms of the asylum system and what have you. And so a lot of those people aren't coming, which means a lot of that market, the sort of smuggling market and the services that criminal organizations were providing to migrants has dropped out. But what we're seeing is they're just adapting and throwing their arms around other criminal markets. So extortion is going up. They're preying more on people within the country. They're raising the prices of those who still want to try and make that trip. So like you see in all sort of capitalist markets, when something changes, the organisms that are profiting from it adapt. They change prices, they change focus, they change strategy. So if you took away illegal drugs, I think you'd see some seismic shifts, but would you see the end of organized crime in Latin America? I think that's a hard no from what I've seen so far, but like many things in life, you never really know how they're going to impact until you implement them, right? But I do agree with you that it's very unlikely in our lifetime that we're going to see any kind of state level legalization of anything beyond marijuana in any country in the Americas, the US or any country south of the US-Mexico border.
I think it's funny because every time I interview someone, whether it's military, law enforcement, or anything else, it's always split down the middle what they think about that. If you're looking for a recovery shake that actually does its job, check out Formula One from First Form. It's a rapid digesting whey protein isolate made for post-workout recovery. That means that it gets into your system fast to help the muscles repair and cut down soreness. It mixes ultra smooth, it's easy on your stomach, and it tastes legit. All the flavors are good, but for me, Cinnamon Toast Crunch is hands down the best one. Plus, it's NSF certified for sport and Informed Choice certified, so you know it's clean. First Form is giving free shipping on orders over $100, and if you don't love it, they'll give you your full refund. Hit the link in the description and grab Cinnamon Toast Crunch Formula One today. Out here on Borderland, we talk a lot about cartels and traffickers, but some threats hit closer to home. Take the CJ&G timeshare scam we covered. People get scammed out of thousands. Their personal info stolen and sold online. Your name, your address, phone numbers, even your family's info can end up in the wrong hands, putting you at risk for identity theft, scams, or worse. I value having control over my personal data, and that is why I've teamed up with DeleteMe. Like the experts we've talked to on Borderland, who go after bad actors, DeleteMe works to remove your personal info from hundreds of people search and data broker sites. They do it continuously, securely, and without outsourcing. Real privacy advisors are available if you need help. For over 15 years, DeleteMe has been leading the fight to protect personally identifiable information for individuals and businesses' employees. They verify your info is accurate on these sites before removing it, cutting down unnecessary exposure. It's very simple. Just create an account, fill in your basic information on the dashboard, and DeleteMe takes care of the rest. You'll receive a report about what was removed in about a week. So take control of your personal info. Go to joindeleteme.com/ironclad and use coupon code Ironclad or scan the QR code to get started. One of the few services that actually keep your information out of the wrong hands. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on Claudia Schiffer?
It's not. It's
You
bleak.
Yeah, the subject is just, it's tough. You have a country who, like, the country itself is gorgeous. The country itself, the culture is beautiful. I love everything about it. Unfortunately, the cartel side of things can get a little muddy, and not even just a little, a lot, because the influence on corruption, the financial backing that they have, and it just makes everything, even the politics, confusing. Like, you don't know which is right and how long it will be right if they are on the right path, right? And so
That's right. And I think it's really important to point out, and this is something we've been doing as well as an organization a lot, because the word cartel is used very heavily in the rhetoric of not only your government, but all governments in the region to justify hardline crackdowns, state of emergencies, mega prisons, all of these sorts of things. But, cartels as a concept, the idea that we're talking about these, vertically integrated corporations that are controlled by one or two people, like, that is just not a reality of the way that drug trafficking works in Latin America anymore. We're talking about layers of different, semi-autonomous organizations, a constantly evolving and changing set of alliances and allegiances, both within states and countries and the entire region. The idea that, El Mayo or El Chapo could pick up the phone and, like, tell the Sinaloa cartel what to do, that has long not been the case. Like, this is a very kind of, ever evolving and morphing sort of shifting of tectonic plates within an industry that's, like, made up of so many different parts who are often working with rivals. So it's also important to like grasp that this is a very kind of disparate industry with so many different actors and alliances and allegiances that are constantly changing, that it is a deeply complex security challenge. It's not, President Trump talks about sending troops into Mexico, and, like, it's like, well, where are you going to send them? Like, there's no cartel headquarters. There's no sort of hornet's nest that if you take out, suddenly all of this is going to go away. And we're talking about global industry, Vince. Most of the precursors coming into Mexico from China, from Central American ports, into Mexican ports, also from other countries in Asia and Europe, there's so many parts of the chain that simply kind of taking out some clandestine lab in the Sinaloa mountains that's cooking meth, like, that's not going to break the chain. This is a multifaceted industry that needs very sort of finely tuned and detailed law enforcement strategies to make any kind of serious dent in things.
Yeah. So let me touch on that. Do you think the U.S.'s approach currently is helping or hurting this fight for trying to dismantle, slow down, disrupt the cartel? Do you think the actions of the Trump administration currently is working? Does the Mexican communities feel like they want America involved more? Or is this somehow, I don't know, causing more tension? Because you see what's happening down in, other countries, Colombia and whatnot. And is this just kind of shifting the focus somewhere else? And so now someone else is going to get more power?
I think in some ways what the US is doing is something that it's always done. There's this steady plod of case law, right? Money laundering, taking down synthetic trafficking rings, taking down weed producers. All of that case law is part of the drug war, and it has happened and continued. And I think it is a necessary strand of the drug war, because it is in some ways a deterrent. These sentencings and trials. If you're asking me about kind of the more hardline, hard power approach that we're seeing from the Trump administration in terms of, offering / threatening to invade Mexico, that is a very controversial element of the drug war here in Mexico. Of course, there are some Mexicans, largely on the conservative side, that do believe they need American help. But for a lot of Mexicans, it's a sovereignty issue, right? And invading Mexico, and President Claudia Sheinbaum has been very clear that she's rejecting those offers of military help from President Trump. So to me, I do think if American troops roll across the US-Mexico border without Sheinbaum's consent, that is a very aggressive move. And I don't think that either Mexicans or Americans on the US-Mexico border want to see another war erupt between Mexico and the US. I think it's very unlikely to happen. But to your point about the Caribbean, look, we're being asked by the Trump administration to sort of take their word on what's happening down there. And let's say that the majority of boats that have been struck by those missiles were drug trafficking boats. We're talking about, they're sort of killing the postman instead of, going to the people sending the post. Like, the people who move those drugs in boats like that are very low level, low ranking, fishermen and maybe organized crime operatives, but they're not the leaders of sort of transnational drug trafficking groups. Taking them out is not going to stop the flow of drugs to the US, that it's just going to force them to seek other routes and other means. What it is also doing, Vince, and I think this is really crucial, is it's kind of saying to other countries in the region, you know what, it's actually fine to shoot first and ask questions later, or blow boats out of the water without any, sort of legal basis in your own country to do that, because we have seen Trump taken to task in the US in terms of the legality of those attacks. Now, countries in Latin America have for years taken hardline approaches to the drug war and to criminal organizations, but they've come up against a lot of criticism from human rights organizations, from their own citizens, because, people question whether that's the way to do that. Now, if the most powerful nation in the world is coming here and doing that too, a nation that used to kind of be a bastion for human rights and all these kind of highfalutin values, then really it's just saying, yeah, you know what, you can just carry on doing what you're doing regardless of what the sort of the human rights consequences are, and the implications for the rule of law, right? If you are doing things that your own legislation doesn't allow and doesn't permit for, it's kind of a green light to sort of do whatever you want, regardless of what your legislation says. And that's a dangerous precedent to set in terms of the value of the rule of law, right? Because it's saying it doesn't matter. Do whatever you want if it's politically convenient to you. And I think what we are seeing in the Caribbean fits with the general kind of strong arm approach we've seen from the Trump administration. Trump 1 wasn't quite as aggressive as Trump 2, which is this big talk, this very simple talk, but actually it's kind of trying to do heart surgery with a spoon. Like, this is a very nuanced problem, and it needs a very nuanced approach. And just blowing up boats is not that, in my view.
Yeah, I hear you. So what are your thoughts on Claudia Sheinbaum?
I mean, look, when she came in, I think I had some doubts in the sense that she was kind of pushed up to power by her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who came before her. And she very much came in his shadow. What I do think, if you're looking at her on a global stage, what I do think Trump has handed her is a chance to shine and be a very level-headed line holder to some of his rhetoric. I think she has been a sort of steady and authoritative counter voice to some of his narrative around Mexico and Mexico's role in the drug trade. She is also facing a very formidable task here in Mexico. I mean, 20 years of a drug war, a deeply compromised legal system, a deeply compromised military. There's really only so much she can do as one person. But she does feel like a safer pair of hands in this respect than her predecessor did, who kind of took his foot off the gas in terms of his county narcotics ops. And I'm sure you followed all the stuff with the relationship between the US and Mexico during his administration, the problems with DEA and like some of the cases that came up. So I would say on the whole, I'd give her a thumbs up with the limitations that she's bound by.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about how you explored women's roles in cartels and the book you wrote, Narcos. I'm very interested in that and to hear more about that, because with the public's eye, you don't see it too often. I think there was, Grisalia, that the Netflix movie, right? Netflix show. So that was the first time I ever seen any kind of story about a female in a very powerful position. And still, I don't think publicly I see too much. I see a lot of their girlfriends, when you go to like websites like borderbeat.com or whatnot and just try and look at what's going on in the news, you'll see girlfriends get arrested or girlfriends get in trouble or female influencers getting killed, murdered. But you don't often see a female who's involved in the cartel in that kind of capacity.
Yeah, I mean, part of the interest in women was really personal because, the more I covered organized crime, the more I saw just how gendered and stereotyped a lot of the narratives we were seeing about organized crime in the media were, right? So you have these, the Pablo Escobars and the Chapos, who are these kind of, if you'll pardon my French, like big swinging dicks of organized crime. And like, there was something that was like by definition male about traffickers. But the more I sort of looked into case law and things started coming across my desk where I realized that there were a lot of women at very high-ranking parts of the drug trafficking chain who weren't pretty and didn't have big boobs and didn't have like Instagram accounts, but were kind of part of this incredibly important sort of game of chess that takes place with law enforcement, right? They rise up quite high and then they're taken into custody and then they are sort of this kind of haggling goes on between them and US prosecutors, right? Who can you give us to lower your sentence and get out fast? And I found a lot of women who were part of the drug trafficking chain from Colombia to the United States that were very invisible, but fundamental parts of these massive cases. And that to me spoke to a very big misunderstanding of like the perception we have of women. And like, I don't to be honest, and like I don't mean to be kind of disrespectful, but I think a lot of that comes from the fact that much of organized crime has been covered by men, and the narratives around organized crime have been created by men. And part of what we see is kind of this male gaze fantasy that's sort of filtered by misogyny and the patriarchy, where women have no agency. They're co-opted into the business. They don't make any decisions. They've always got a gun to their head. They're the pretty accessory. And it robs them of all kind of power and agency. And so those narratives then influence the way that we investigate organized crime, that we report organized crime. And so you don't have many women in the room really being asked any questions, and the assumption being made that like they don't have any power, right? And I think our understanding of power is also really limited. And I think for women, our power is seen as sexual or as being part of the family. But power is so nuanced, and the way that women exercise power is very nuanced. And I always say this, I don't know whether you were brought up in a family with two parents. I was. My family's from the Mediterranean. And like when I look at the way that my parents operate and the decision making, it really doesn't happen that like my dad's making all the decisions and my mum's just stirring the sauce at the stove. You know, if you look at the way that relationships work in families and the interaction between women and other family members, it's very nuanced, and women are very powerful. And when you consider that organized crime are clan-based organizations, especially in this region, the role of women and their relationship with the men in the organization and their relationship with the children in the organization, all of that feeds into a very nuanced, much more interesting role of women in organized crime than just the Emma Coronels or, you know, the Instagram influencers with the big boobs and the Barretts, I'd say.
I would love to hear. I just ordered your book, but I'd love to hear a story of one of the females and like, I guess essentially what their role is, because in my head, when I think of these cartel leaders, they have so much power. You know, they're not just calling shots, but you know, they're taking out threats. You know, and are some of these women involved in some of the killings that we hear? Are they involved in some of those big decision makings? You know, is that the kind of that's the level of their significance into some of these cartels?
There's no doubt that once women learn that violence is a currency that oils their organization, that they are complicit in violence, most killings, Vince, in organized crime are delegated. You know, most bosses do have to have blood on their hands to kind of assert power and status and authority. But a lot of the killing is outsourced to the armed wing of the organization, right? So I found women all across the region who were ordering hits and greatly feared by the communities that they lived in. So I think this idea that women don't manage or use violence is also, again, something that we don't want to see, right? Because it offends us. Because for us, women are the mothers of the family, the nurturers, the carers, the peacemakers. So this idea that we're capable of those sorts of things is really abhorrent, as is the idea that we bring our children into the drug trade. You know, you've seen what's playing out in Sinaloa, right? You've got El Chapo, and now who's now in you know, serving life in the U.S., and his 4 sons are now kind of in the crosshairs of the DEA and taking over his faction of the Sinaloa cartel. 2 of his sons are already in custody in the U.S. You don't have anyone being like, "Oh God, what a terrible father," you know, that his kids have inherited this drug empire, right? If anything, the Chapitos, as they're known, are kind of this very feared symbol of organized crime power. If women pull their children into organized crime, it's seen as such an affront to maternity, to our role as mothers, you know. But for them, just like for men, business and family become the same thing. And I think it's such an affront to us to kind of be able to see that about women. And, you mentioned Griselda at the beginning of this question. And I think the Netflix series actually went quite soft on the kind of person that Griselda was. She was, according to some historic accounts, she was the daughter of a sex worker. She started killing when she was 11 or 12. She learned very early that violence was a source of power. So the idea that she only started killing when she got to Miami is just a total glossing over of her whole history when she was trafficking in New York.
The
We had another
made-for-TV
trafficker from her
version.
time, Yolanda Sarmiento, who was Argentine, who chopped up her rivals in a bathtub. Again,
Jesus.
it's something that we choose not to see about women because it's so uncomfortable. But I think if you can try and take off the blinders that we have in terms of gender stereotypes and try and see what is rather than what we want to see or what we expect to see, there would be a much more nuanced understanding of the role that women play, And I have had a lot of questions like, well, what's different about the role they play? And what do they do as opposed to what men do? And I'm like, I don't know whether those questions are even relevant in the sense that all women can be CEOs or CFOs or, teachers or nurses or doctors. Do you know what I mean? Women are capable of doing all sorts of things. So this idea that they would only be restricted to certain parts of the drug trade and organized crime is also a desire to sort of stereotype them in a way. So I tried to veer
Yeah.
away from that, but I did find women managing violence, corruption, transportation, money laundering, all parts of the drug trafficking trade at all levels.
If you're into quality gear, you need Tac Pack, a monthly subscription box loaded with tactical gear from the top brands like Battle Arms Development, 9line, 511, and more. You can choose from Tac Pack Standard, $59.95 shipped with $90 to $120 worth of products, or Tac Pack Plus, $139.95 shipped with $240 to $300 worth of products. This September, Tac Pack Plus is stacked with over $330 worth of gear, including Battle Arms Development, 9line, and Next Level Armament. Use code Ironclad at TacPack.com for a free $70 tactical gift, pushing your value past $400. Tac Pack, gear you'll actually use. I want to thank our partners over at Ammo Squared. They've built what they call America's Ammunition Reserve, basically an ammo savings account. You sign up, pick from more than 70 calibers, set your auto buy budget, and either choose a shipping schedule or just let your reserve grow. Over time, your ammo stacks up and is stored for free in a climate-controlled facility in Texas or Idaho until you're ready to ship. No minimums, no extra fees. It works whether you got a small budget or just don't want to drop a few grand at once. Thank you so much, Ammo Square, for providing such a cool service and supporting the show. When I was an agent, I got into it was a failure to yield with a girl who was 16 years old, and she was known for smuggling, and she got through the checkpoints quite a bit because she looked like just a young 16-year-old girl.
I mean,
And
this is what I'm
eventually
saying.
she ran. She drove her truck into the Rio Grande River. She broke her arm as she swam across with one arm, right?
Right.
Really tough young girl.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
everyone heard the story. And then
Yeah.
later on, we were able to catch her. And it was just shocking to see, this is a high level smuggler at a young age as well.
Well, and it's a question for you, Vince. I mean, you've worked in law enforcement and what I'm talking about, the male lens, and the way that organized crime is investigated. I've spoken to a lot of former DEA agents. None of them are women. I've spoken to a lot of prosecutors, a few more women in the prosecutor side and the criminal defense side. And, I do think that speaks to if you don't have female representation or enough female representation in law enforcement, then you're not going to get this multi-gendered approach to investigation, right? But I'm curious, when you were, on the other side and you were investigating cases and you've heard what I've said, like, does that resonate, or did you see something else?
No, I mean, to be honest, I never thought anything of women in smuggling as like a higher position in the cartels. It just wasn't something that I was aware of. What we seen was women being used as mules, right? Carrying loads, beautiful women coming through checkpoints trying to draw your attention away from they might be smuggling dope. And then this young individual who was known for smuggling was probably the biggest eye opener. Like, oh man, some of these women could be like big dogs in this whole organization. So that was the first time I've ever heard of it. And then watching that Netflix show, I was like, wow, that's a fascinating to see. And I've never been of the mind of that a woman didn't have the capability to do it, or or even the I would say even the aggression to do something like that. Not at all. I just never saw it personally, right? It was never something that I ever, out of all the things we've done in my career, I've never heard of a female being in charge of something like that. So hearing that was like, man, that's fascinating. And I don't know why I never thought of it, because I don't see why they wouldn't be able to.
Right. And it's really interesting actually in Griselda that the person who works it out eventually is a female police officer, right? And it
Yeah.
dawns on her, and then like she passes it up the chain. But do you think that you've never seen that because it didn't occur to you, or that it didn't exist, or that you didn't look for it? Like, what do you think was
Yeah.
were the
I
dynamics
mean,
at the time?
when you get into law enforcement, you just kind of go by what has been done in the past, and we do all the research and everything else. I just never saw in my line of focus a
Mm,
female being in charge, but
mhm.
also we're a very male heavy organization. And so in that sense, maybe wasn't working with enough women to give me that perspective as well. Right.
Mm,
And so I'm not sure. I mean, I worked all throughout the Southwest border of Texas, of Arizona, of California. And, I worked for, at a very, very high pace unit. And we were able to do a lot of apprehensions of different levels of cartel and cartel involvement, and it wasn't there. I saw their wives, I saw their girlfriends, kind of thing, same kind of concept. But no,
sure,
I never
sure.
thought there was anything bigger than that.
Yeah, what's really interesting on the border, and we covered this a lot at Vice too, is that when it comes to human trafficking, which is different to human smuggling, right? Like human smuggling is when you're trying to get into the US and you consent to being moved. Human trafficking is when you're kind of lied to, brought into an industry, and then you're like forced into prostitution or slave labor or
Yeah.
whatever. Many of the heads of those rings are women. And I believe that is because of what you say. I think there is an innate trust that people have in women that they don't have in men. Like when my Uber arrives and it's a female driver, my default thing is like, oh, it's a woman. Like I think she's less likely to like do me wrong, right? Even I
Yeah.
think that after I've written my book. It's so programmed into us. But I think that's really used by organized crime to keep women off the radar, trick people into criminal industries that are then very, very challenging to escape. And, even though we are in an age now where even the existence of gender is being questioned, we see women at all points of the chain in all legal industries, right? Like women heading up corporations and what have you. I don't think the fight is won, but like it's more common. Even though that now exists, when it comes to the underworld, I think people fail to like make those connections that there is also this kind of increasing involvement of women in that kind of area of work, and as well the sort of I think like raw ambition and desire to take risks and ability and like the decisions to take risks that are involved in organized crime, like that is, whether you respect it or not, like it's a gamble, right? And it's a ballsy gamble because if you get caught, you're going to either die, end up in jail for the rest of your life, end up severely injured or whatever the consequences are. And like the fact that women are choosing often to insert themselves in those worlds is also a sign, I think, of some like ambitious desire and a want for status and power.
Yeah. I don't. Well, I haven't read your book yet, but I'm curious. Has there been a time where a leader of a cartel, one of these smaller ones, has been a woman?
Yeah. I mean, one of the women in the book is Luz Fajardo Campos. She was based in Sinaloa. She worked with the Sinaloa cartel, but she ran her own independent trafficking ring. She and her adult sons were moving cocaine and meth to parts of the United States. There's a lot of case law about her. Um, and she operated, as far as I can tell, with her adult sons. You know, she had, according to her case documents, she had been the victim of violence growing up. She was raised by her grandparents. She trained as a lawyer. She could have done other things. She decided to get into the dope business, and she was eventually caught in Colombia. And the consequences for her were really dire. And when she was arrested in Colombia, she was extradited to the US. Her adult sons were killed in Mexico brutally, I think as a warning from the higher ups in the Sinaloa cartel saying, if you talk to US prosecutors, everyone in your family is going to end up like this, right? And she was based in Sinaloa. A lot of her existing family still live in Sinaloa. And she didn't plead guilty. She went to trial and is now serving about 25 years. But she operated as an independent cell, running her own business and working with other parts of the Sinaloa cartel, sourcing her own supplies in Colombia, contracting her own transporters in Central America, and, running the whole line. So, and there's plenty of cases like her. There's a couple more cases in the book, but my feeling is for all the cases that I know about, there are dozens of others that
Yeah.
either haven't been investigated or aren't in the documentation yet, or women who haven't been caught and they're still operating for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating. Last question. So based on everything you see that's going on, is there any realistic solution to mitigating a lot of the violence that's happening in Mexico right now? Is there any thoughts on how that can improve so Mexico can flourish, Mexico can be a place where there's not violence on the street often? Is there a step in the right direction that you can see happening that would help that?
I mean, I think if there was an easy solutions, we would have seen that by now, right? I think in Mexico, it's so broad. It's about poverty, it's about education, it's about the legal system and impunity and corruption. Of course, there needs to be work on all prongs. For a lot of people in Mexico and a lot of young men and women, there is a glamour and a status and an intrigue to being part of criminal armies, right? If they lived in a society where there was access to great education and job opportunities that didn't require that, I'm sure we would see less people joining the ranks of organized crime. But that doesn't exist, and a lot of people go into the business knowing that they will die young. But they feel for one reason or another that it's the most attractive option to them and they take it. So there's that, right? But there's also sort of, I think, this very simplistic narrative about the drug business and the good guys and the bad guys. And if you look at the corruption and the co-option of democratic institutions and countries, it's very clear to see that the criminal organizations are aided and abetted by not just law enforcement, but politicians and political power. And if you look at the kind of stuff that we've seen over the last few decades, which clearly isn't working, like I was very pleased to hear that like the Sackler family and Purdue have been asked to like basically dismantle the company, and like that legal pharmaceutical company is being really sort of put to the wall as much as we've seen for having created the opioid crisis, right?
Yeah.
So I think we do really need to like have a much more nuanced understanding of organized crime. And the whole point of Insight Crime, which is the NGO I work for, is we're trying to hold the line and enforce and help like amplify all of these nuanced facts around these really oversimplified strategies towards organized crime. Like, I'm sure you've heard the term cartel of the suns now a few times, which
Yes.
is used to refer to this quote unquote cartel that's run by President Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. Like, that's such a sort of dangerous misunderstanding of what is actually an umbrella term for government embedded corruption in Venezuela, the likes of which we see all over the region, you know? So this idea that like Maduro is running a cartel corporation is just not, it's not based in any reality. And I feel like it's the use of those oversimplified concepts that allow the justification of what we're seeing in certain parts of the region. And they're dangerous because, you know, again, you need nuanced tools for a nuanced problem. And I think in a way, like, politicians give to this demand for quick results and visible results. And like the drug war and the drug business and the drug problem just isn't going to be won that way. It's a very long-term sort of solution. And the problem is that people want to see short-term results. And that's just been on repeat for the last 4 or 5 decades, sadly.
Yeah, no, well, I appreciate everything. I'm excited to read your book. Thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything else you want to add, or where anyone who's listening can find you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram as Bonello, and I'm on X as Mexico Reporter. And of course, please do look up insightcrime.org, where you can find really detailed profiles of all the criminal groups and actors and markets that I'm talking about, from the cocaine business to the Cartel of the Suns. And the more people have a sort of wide understanding of these issues, I think the more they can really, you know, put their politicians to work in perhaps ways that might be a little bit more efficient. But I'm trying to think of something, you know, positive to say. I'd say like, I do feel like there is, you know, I'm really like glad to see that overdoses in the US are dropping. And I think some of that is an impact of the crackdown on the fentanyl trade and this understanding that like you can't kill your users, you know. And I also think we need to have like a more sort of a less kind of penal attitude to drug use. I think drug use in Mexico and the US is just really kind of demonized and criminalized. And like, I think if we understand a little bit more about why people feel compelled to use drugs, and like especially the more harmful ones, then we might make a little bit more progress and see a little bit less violence. But yeah, I mean, please read the book, and thanks for listening and watching, I guess, and thanks for bringing me on the show.
Thank you for listening to Borderland, Narcosis, an Ironclad original, presented by First Form. Go check out your First Form supplements at firstform.com/borderland. Till next time, y'all.